in the conference room, Loretta.
What?
One, it's dark. You can hardly see me. Two, I need something to hold my phone.
I can go get it. It's dark. You on the light?
Look at my face.
Do we have everyone? If you'll, I will go at your word.
Okay.
Do we have Mustafa on the line? I don't see his name. Or is he under someone else's name? Tom Clements. Hey, Tom. Hello, folks. Welcome. Glad that you're able to join us on this wonderful Thursday afternoon. I do want to give a few minutes to Mustafa, who will be leading us off with our conversation today. Just want to give him a minute or so. But my name is Lindsay Harper, National Coordinator for Arm in Arm, where we're working to ignite a transformational era, ending the climate crisis, centering racial and economic justice. I'm very glad to be here. And I want to go ahead and thank New Alpha Community Development Corporation for bringing this whole thing together, for the friends, family, supporters in the room, for the Environmental Protection Agency Office of Public Engagement and Education. It's fantastic to have everyone here today. This is a great time, an exciting time. There's lots of opportunity and we've got some wonderful people in the room. So very excited about our conversation today. We're going to give Mustafa maybe another minute or so before we get started. Definitely want to make sure that we respect folks' time. I think I can say while we're waiting, I can just briefly go over our agenda for today. So we're going to start with an overview of community needs from Mustafa Santiago Ali. Then we're going to hear from Dana Smith about forested communities. And then we're going to hear about regulatory issues from Dr. Adrian Hollis, water issues from Monica Patrick, infrastructure and environment from Frank Biggers, remediation issues from Queen Shabazz, implementation and cumulative issues from Reverend Leo Woodbury. So yes, a great overview of some critical issues happening now, right now, that have been happening for a really long time. So we've got some incredible minds and folks with lived experiences on the line to share today. Reverend Woodbury, if I may ask, I would like to take your guidance on this. I want to make sure that we get Mustafa on, but I also understand that I don't see him on the line yet. How would you like to move forward? Is that something we can come back to?
Hi, sorry. This is Rosemary, Barkley. I just joined. Sorry for being late.
Hi, Rosemary. Welcome. Glad you're here.
Thank you.
Hi, Rosemary. You had me sweating.
No.
Thank you so much. We're so thankful and grateful for this opportunity to join together with you and the Office of Public Engagement and Education at EPA.
Absolutely.
Is Max or anyone else joining us?
No, just me.
Okay, great. All right.
Rev Mulberry, Mustafa said he'll join us as soon as he can. He's finishing up another presentation right now.
Okay. Did he say how long?
He did not.
Okay. So we might want to start, and we can just insert Mustafa where he when he gets on, because we want to be respectful of folks' time. Or I'll tell you what we can do for people who may not be familiar with your office, Rosemary, and what you do. Do you mind sharing a bit of that with us? And Mustafa might pop on.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Reverend Woodbury, for inviting me. And there's so many familiar faces on this call, so I'm really excited to be amongst friends, old and new. I'll take a step back and introduce myself. So again, I'm Rosemary Bakri. I am the Associate Administrator for the Office of Public Engagement and Environmental Education over at the Environmental Protection Agency. And my job is to coordinate all of the EPA administrators' stakeholder engagement and making sure that we are working in conjunction with communities to really hear some of the issues that are going on the ground, and really making sure that it's being connected to the administrator, that he has an opportunity to work with communities directly and hear from folks directly. And so I do a lot of that coordination and outreach for the administrator. For the work that we do at the agency, it's really easy for environmental groups or for industry to get into the fold. But sometimes it's hard for faith communities or, even sometimes environmental justice communities to get access into the agency and working in conjunction with the administrator. And so that's the role that I serve, is to ensure that the administrator is able to hear directly from communities, especially in this moment, right? Where environmental justice is centered as a massive priority for the government and for the agency. So really making sure that the administrator is able to hear from folks like you, people who are on the ground, seeing firsthand things that are happening in communities and being able to elevate that and raise that. And so my office works to create that two-way dialogue, not just with the administrator, but across the board, to ensure that people are responding to issues that folks are seeing on the ground. And so I'm just really excited to be back at the agency and be able to do this really important work. Another portion of my job is to focus on environmental education. We talk a lot about the environment, and we talk a lot about climate change, but sometimes those can be buzzwords for certain communities where, it's like, okay, yeah, climate change, what does that actually mean? How does that actually affect me? How is it connected to me? And as you all know, that is, the environment and climate change are extremely connected to everybody, especially underserved and overburdened communities. And so it's really important that we start to lean in and focus on environmental education in schools and working with teachers and students and after school care programs to really start connecting the dots and making sure people understand their environment, why we need to work to protect it, and why why folks need to be advocates around if they see something that's going on or that's wrong or that needs to be changed within their community around the environment. So we really work with a lot of entities on that, trying to engage more historically Black colleges and universities. We have an administrator who was a graduate of North Carolina A&T, and he is just really excited about engaging historically Black colleges and universities, but also some Title I schools to be able to lean in and to talk about the environment in a very real and tangible way.
Thank you for that. Oh, excuse me.
No, I was going to say, turn it over to you, Lindsay.
Oh, thanks, Bev. I appreciate it. Rosemary, thank you for sharing that information. It's also my really first time connecting with the office as well, so I appreciate that. And also as a fellow Bison Howard University, very excited to be in this space, I must say. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and kick it off to Dana Smith, who's in Asheville, North Carolina. She's Executive Director of the Dogwood Alliance, who's going to talk to us about forested communities. Dana, take it away, please.
Thanks so much, Lindsay, and thanks, Rosemary, for taking time out today. I'm the, as Lindsay said, Executive Director of Dogwood Alliance. We're a Southern-based organization working to advance environmental justice and climate action through protecting forests and communities from destructive industrial logging practices. And I'm here to talk about how rural low-income communities of color across the Southern U.S. are disproportionately bearing the brunt of the pollution and ecological destruction of our nation's production of wood products. Experts estimate that the rate and scale of Southern forest destruction from logging is 4 times that of South American rainforests. And though Southern forests are our nation's most diverse, they are also our least protected. So in addition to the large-scale destruction of forests, large wood processing plants emit lots of air pollution, which is compromising the health of nearby residents. And of course, the disproportionate impacts of that are also borne by low-income and communities of color. Many of these same communities are suffering from disproportionately high poverty rates, unemployment, and other indicators of socioeconomic stress. The logging and the wood production just really has yet to deliver equitable economic benefits to these rural communities, and is compromising our health and is putting us all at greater risk from climate change. Recently, these communities have become the target of a rapidly expanding global market for wood pellets. Power stations in Europe are burning these pellets under the guise of green, renewable energy. And government at every level is ignoring community concerns about the added and cumulative impacts of the air pollution, as well as the unregulated clear cutting of forests along rivers that provide natural flood protection at a time when our communities are suffering from extreme flooding impacts associated with climate change. Concerns about the health impacts of the air pollution from these mills have been repeatedly ignored by state agencies as permit after permit is issued. And there's a consistent pattern of wood pellet companies grossly underestimating the amount of emissions as they're applying for permits. And so therefore, they're currently regulated under minor source air permits. But consistent documentation shows violations of these minor source air permits. For example, one lawsuit in North Carolina resulted in a company having to install additional pollution control equipment. And in Louisiana, just this year, a wood pellet mill was issued a $2.5 million fine for exceeding pollution limits under its permit. So local groups recently filed a petition to EPA to stop a permit for a wood pellet mill in Adel, Georgia, due to the lack of the state providing any opportunity for public comment on the permit, and because of the health concerns and the fear that this really should be regulated as a major source of air pollution, not a minor source. Communities are also concerned about the clear cutting of forests along the rivers as the flooding is getting worse, because standing forests provide really important natural flood control. And meanwhile, the forestry industry is exempt from a lot of the rules and regulations under the Clean Water Act. This market for wood pellets is continuing to grow unabated as governments around the world continue to designate the burning of wood or biomass for electricity as carbon neutral, when at least 800 scientists backed by mountains of peer-reviewed science say otherwise. Finally, Southern communities are concerned about climate change, obviously, and the disproportionate impacts in the South, and believe that the forest industry at large should be held accountable for its climate impacts. Logging is the leading driver of carbon emissions from US forests, but currently these emissions are not being transparently reported or accounted for in the EPA annual greenhouse gas inventory. And we just did a lot of work with Rev Leo and others, the Southeastern Climate and Energy Network, Gulf Center for Law and Policy, to develop really from the ground up, hear the voices of frontline communities to develop a Southern Communities for a Green New Deal. And based on that platform and what communities want, there are 5 asks that we have of the EPA right now. The first is to reject the policy that was adopted by the Trump administration, declaring biomass as carbon neutral. This ask that we have is consistent with the position taken by the state of North Carolina in its clean energy plan during Michael Reagan's tenure as the Secretary of the Department of Natural Resources. The second ask is to grant the petition filed by the citizens of Cook County to stop the wood pellet mill in Adel, Georgia, and require the state to invite public comments. The third ask is to direct states to comply with their responsibility under the Civil Rights Act to consider disproportionate impacts to environmental justice communities and to assess cumulative impacts in issuing permits. The fourth ask is to report carbon emissions associated with logging in accordance with the latest science and methodology as part of EPA's annual greenhouse gas inventory report. And finally, the fifth ask is to strengthen Clean Water Act rules related to forestry to expand protection for forests along rivers, creeks, and streams. So Rosemary, we'd welcome an opportunity to have a separate meeting with you and others at EPA with the communities on the front lines of this industry to discuss these issues in more detail. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'll flag my colleague, Matt Tejada has joined as well. Matt Tejada is the director of the Environmental Justice Office. I'm sure many of you probably already know him very well, but he joined me on this conversation because we knew how important it was, but also how important Reverend Woodbury is and how important you all are as advocates. So I want to make sure that he has an opportunity to say hello. But thank you so much, Dana, for that. And I'm going to put my email in the chat, and folks should definitely feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to follow up with you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosemary. Hey, sorry, everyone. And several of you, including you, Reverend Woodbury, have emails from me for the last 15 minutes saying I'm in the waiting room of a Google meeting. So I'm sorry I got that. But I'm here. I apologize. I missed the beginning of it. But I'm Matthew Dodd. I'm the director of the Environmental Justice Program here at EPA. I'm very happy to see some familiar faces, but many, many brand new faces.
Well, welcome, Matthew. Sorry for the confusion, but glad you're here. And thank you, Dana, for your comments. I'm Southerner myself, so I'm very, very much interested in Southern issues. I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Adrienne Hollis, who is in DC and is the Senior Climate Justice and Health Scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And she's going to talk to us about regulatory issues. Dr. Hollis?
Thank you, Lindsay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm just going to briefly talk about some issues, including some pending, recently submitted regulations that I was on a panel this morning where we were talking about them. So it's kind of exciting. So in order to talk about where we're going, I need to just briefly touch on where we were. So in the last 4 years, more than 100 environmental regulations had been or in the process of being rolled back or overturned. Actually, 98 were completed and 14 were in progress for a total of 112 at the end of the administration. Major climate policies were dismantled and many more rules governing clean air, clean water, wildlife, and toxic chemicals were under attack. Of those, 28 completed rollbacks were focused on air pollution and emissions, and 2 were in progress. 14 regulations on infrastructure and planning were completed. And this is important because of the potential for exposure due to inadequate housing infrastructure for one reason, and inadequate transportation infrastructure. 8 regulations related to water pollution and aerosolized contaminants were completed. 1 was in progress, and there were 9 rollbacks completed around toxic substances and safety, and 1 was in progress. That is 63 pieces of legislation that play an important role in protecting our health and have a large impact on the quality of the air we breathe, 63. But the good news is that to date, 100 days into this administration, President Biden has signed more than 39 executive orders, 25 in the first 30 or so days. While all of them are very important and very much needed, a few stand out for me in the communities with whom I work. Those include those that are related to the climate crisis directly, and there were 2 that specifically talked about the climate crisis. Those that were related to COVID-19, as we're definitely dealing with an airborne illness, and we're dealing with issues around equity in the vaccine rollout around COVID-19. Over half of the 25 that I mentioned initially were dealing directly with environmental justice, although others did talk about environmental justice or recognize it equally. Some talked about equity in the administration and talked about worker safety and health and things that all of us have been concerned about in the past. So there have been a number of new regulations that have been introduced rather recently, and those were discussed on an environmental justice panel, as I mentioned this morning, with the Energy and Commerce, the Committee on Energy and Commerce. One is the Clean Futures Act, although I am only focusing on the environmental justice portion of the act, because there are some issues around the the Clean Futures Act itself. The environmental justice and underserved communities portion of this act focuses on environmental justice, requirement that 40% of the funds made available under the Clean Future Act benefit environmental justice communities, and that's important. And in addition, the bill creates a new selection of grant programs and regulatory requirements to support EJ initiatives, and that's important. Another particularly important act that stands out is the Climate Smart Ports Act from Representative Barragan, and Senator Merkley has a companion bill. The Climate Smart Ports Act creates a $1 billion a year grant program at EPA for zero emissions equipment and technology at ports. And that's very important because it helps ports and port users replace trucks and cargo handling equipment and more in an effort to get to zero emissions. The bill ensures a minimum of 25% of funding that goes to non-attainment areas. And it also has grant applications that are scored using various criteria. I won't go into too much detail now. One we are all probably very familiar with is the Environmental Justice for All Act, thanks to Representative Grijalva and McEachin. This piece of federal legislation was created from the ground up, and it's an unusual but correct approach by involving EJ communities from the beginning and throughout the process. It acknowledges how factors like segregation and racism and zoning practices have rendered us as communities of color vulnerable to the effects of pollution and climate change, and of course, COVID-19 and other health disparities. And it talks about federal permitting through the National Environmental Policy Act and the creation of climate resiliency plans, among other things like cumulative impact assessment, that we've been all talking about. Next, there's the Justice 40 provision of the January 27th executive order that talks about the fact that 40% of the overall benefits should flow to disadvantaged communities. It doesn't say how that's going to happen, but there is a committee in place that has recently been put in place that will help to figure out what that looks like for us. Then there's the ALERT Act, which I'm particularly proud about, by Representative Blunt Rochester. This bill amends the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act of 1986, otherwise known as SARA Title III. And it requires facilities to actually, facilities that have accidental releases to actually have meetings with the community and to have regular monthly meetings with communities to inform the public about the release, any release, an accidental release or whatever, and any type of mitigation plan that they have in place. Whereas before, EPCA was more of an overarching activity. It didn't really involve community engagement at this level. So I find that that is very exciting. And I'm not sure how much time I have, so I better stop now because I could go on, but I do want to mention one, the murky mapping bill, which is, in my opinion, I feel like it's a companion to the EJ Screen because it does some things that EJ Screen doesn't do, but EJ Screen is very important. And I know that a lot of communities are using it and adapting it for them. So if you get a chance, I would look at some of these new bills and maybe even submit comments to the committee so that the bill will pass with support. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hollis. Greatly appreciated. I'm now going to pass to Mustafa. I see you have joined us. Welcome. Glad you're here. We've got Mustafa Ali, who is the Environmental Justice Vice President of the National Wildlife Federation in DC. Hey, Mustafa. You're on mute.
Can y'all hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Well, Dr. Hollis, I think, covered a very comprehensive suite of opportunities that EPA has based upon some of the fantastic actions that folks are doing on Capitol Hill. The real question is, how are you going to make that become real? And how are you going to also make sure that the states, where 80% of the programs that the Environmental Protection Agency are delegated to, has the competencies that are necessary to be able to ensure that the great work that's happening in Washington becomes a reality? And how are you also going to make sure that we got about 2 million people right now who are in federal service? How are you going to make sure that they have the competencies to address these environmental justice issues? So that means that the Environmental Protection Agency and those other 17 federal agencies and departments are going to have to make some decisions. Have to make some decisions around the hiring that you're going to do and making sure that new folks who are hired have environmental justice competencies. You're going to have to make sure that the suite of folks who have not yet been trained actually are trained, one, on the general sets of issues, and then get specific based upon the areas of focus that those respective offices and programs have. You're also going to have to get real serious about, and I know you don't have complete control over this, the regional administrators who have yet to be hired, and making sure that they also have environmental justice competencies, have done work in this space, and that they are going to be able to live up to the amazing set of visions and actions that have been laid out so far. We're also going to have to begin to get real serious about the contracting and subcontracting opportunities that the Environmental Protection Agency is in charge of. If you take a look over the years, very few of those dollars have made it to Black and brown communities, and even fewer of those dollars have actually made it to businesses of color who could have very well have done much of the work. Now, I was there for a while, so I carry some of that burden as well. But this is a new day with a new set of opportunities. And if you are sharing with folks across the country that there are literally going to be hundreds of billions of dollars that are going to be focused on environmental justice, then that means there has to be real accountability built into the process. And yes, Justice 40 is an important step, but 40% of all of the federal resources should be going to communities of color. And Mustafa, why do you say that? Because 40% of the country is people of color, or will very soon be. So if we're serious about changing the dynamics that are happening in our most vulnerable communities, then we got to get real serious about these dollars and build accountability into the process and make sure that that becomes a reality. So those are just a few of the steps. But let me just add a couple more, and I won't take too long. The other part of this is that each of those AAs who are there inside the Environmental Protection Agency need to make sure that they have senior leadership that has expertise in environmental justice, the air program, the water program, RCRA, Superfund, so forth and so on. They've got to have those folks that are in place. And of course, I know that Administrator Regan will also have his senior advisor sometime in the not so distant future. And because EPA has always been the leader in the environmental justice space, they've got to also make sure that these other federal agencies also have a senior advisor for environmental justice, especially since President Biden has shared with us that he wants to have an all-of-government approach. So if you're going to have an all-of-government approach, then that means that you also better have that expertise at those highest levels when you're making policy and budgeting decisions to make sure that it all comes out the way that you would expect it to. And I know that you all are committed to. So those are just a few of the steps. Y'all know I can break this down for you to the nth degree, as my mother would say. But if we're not putting these basic concepts, these basic structures in place, then we're putting ourselves at a disadvantage. And we all know that the clock is ticking. We will be at the midterms within a blink. We'll blink twice, and we will be at the end of 4 years. And we have to be able to have things to show that we made real change happen. I know everybody's dedicated to it. Let's just make sure that we're building the infrastructure inside of the infrastructure to ensure that justice becomes a reality under this administration. Thank you all for a couple of minutes of your time.
Much appreciated, Mustafa. Thank you very much. You know, it's not just the what, it's the how. And so far we've heard some really incredible ways that we can really shift what we're doing so we can actually impact people's lives. That's what we're here for. So I'm going to pass next to Monica Patrick, who is in Detroit, Michigan. She's the executive director of We the People of Detroit, and she's going to talk about water issues. Monica, I'm going to pass to you.
Peace and blessings, everyone. Thank you so much for my time. Can you hear me? All right, thank you. I'm Monica Lewis Patrick, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president and CEO of We the People of Detroit. And I just want to say how grateful I am for the leadership of Dr. Leo Woodbury. You can't say enough about an institution builder. And so thank you for inviting us, and also for my brother and my friend, the great Dr. Mustafa Ali at National Wildlife Federation. But to Sister Rosemary, I've got to talk to you really quickly about what's happening around water affordability. We need to make sure that as we are having this conversation, it's not just lifting what's happening in Detroit around water inequities, water disparities. Water rates have gone up in the city of Detroit over 438% within the last 20 years. That on its face makes it unaffordable when you look at the demographics of the city. Black folks make up about 85% of the population. We have a population where 40% of the population is living in abject poverty. 60% of the households are headed up by Black women that have anywhere from 2 to 4 children. And they're not only holding the city together, they're also caretaking for elders and grandparents and community members. But when you look at around the region of the Great Lakes, what we see in places like Chicago, where water rates have tripled in the last 8 years, when we look at Toledo, where water rates have doubled in the last year and a half, and then only 45 minutes from me in Flint, Flint plays some of the highest water rates in the nation, to the tune of about $250 a month. And they were on pace prior to COVID-19 to seeing their water rates double to the tune of about $500 a month. But we know that this is not only systemic in communities like Detroit and Flint and what's happening in Chicago, but this is a national issue. We know that prior to COVID-19, about 15 million Americans were struggling to keep on their water and access to proper sanitation. We also know right now we need about $8 billion allocated to ensure that there is a pathway, even after COVID, for families to be able to maintain sanitation. And according to research that was conducted by Dr. Elizabeth Mack at Michigan State University, we are on pace by this time next year for 35.6% of the nation not to be able to afford their water. So we know how this lands for Black folks in Detroit because we've been battling for 20 years. We only have a moratorium in place because we were able to shame our local mayor into understanding that there was a direct correlation between public health disparities and cumulative impacts and water shutoffs. It has been generations of Black and brown women pleading with government to understand these public health tie bars. What we are asking is that if we're going to build back better, we've got to make sure that this concept is tie barred to job creation. Those jobs must be connected to jobs, contracts, and training for local communities that have to be a part of this strategy for investing in the water infrastructure. We also need to make sure that we are allowing a pathway of job creation for young folks and returning citizens. We believe that the skilled trades could be a critical part of that tooling up of America. We also would ask that you would look at programs that are headed up by amazing women that are already doing this great work on the front line. If you look at what's happening in Emerald City with Denise Fairchild, that's a great example that you can replicate. If you look at the work by Dr. Alicia Smith at Toledo Junction, that is blue-green infrastructure work that you can replicate. If you look at the work that is headed up by Brenda Coley with Milwaukee Water Commons, that is work that you can replicate to put the American public back to work, to put the taps back on, and to ensure that there's a pathway for clean, safe, and affordable water. We can't wait. We already have the ingenuity and creativity to do it. We just need the money to be released, and we need to ensure that those metrics are there so that as the dollars trickle down, we can ensure that those dollars reach the proper hands so that they motivate the American people to do the things that are just for the American people. So I'll stop there because I can give you more research, more data, more links to give you those models that you need to put the American people's taps back on and to ensure that there is a pathway for clean, safe, and affordable water. Thank you so much for my time.
Well, I must say, I don't know about y'all, but I'm fired up. Thank you, Miss Monica. That was fantastic.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. So to continue our fantastic conversation, I'm going to now pass the mic to Mr. Frank Figures, who is in Mississippi, who is with the Black Christian Leaders Coalition, and he is going to talk about infrastructure and environment. Mr. Frank, I'm passed to you. You're on mute, Mr. Frank. There you
All
go.
right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. And thank you all for this opportunity. I am a lifelong resident of Jackson, Mississippi, a member of Shady Grove Missionary Baptist Church, and I work with a nonprofit called One Voice. Jackson, Mississippi is the capital of the state of Mississippi and the largest city in the state with 160,000+ people. Jackson was founded in 1822 with the majority of the population being enslaved. Once slavery ended, the formerly enslaved population set out to democratize Jackson, the capital, and the entire state of Mississippi. This has been a long, hard, continuous effort. The cumulative impact of this has in many ways led Jackson on a more democratic path, but has also left the residents of the city of Jackson with many challenges. Because of the resistance to equity, justice, and inclusion, Jackson developed in a way with many disparities in the development scheme. Education, housing, land use, public services, as well as income, voting rights, and healthcare, just to name a few. It was only in the mid-1980s that Jackson developed a system of government that provided the majority of its citizens representation. It was also in the mid-1970s and the mid-1980s that the developers began to shift concepts of development out of Jackson into surrounding areas which had been farming, agricultural, and woodland areas. This has contributed to Jackson now being over 95% Black. This trend developed in the mid-1980s. Jackson had developed in many ways that the best infrastructure was on the east and the north side. Jackson is a legacy city with a consent decree regarding its water. We want all citizens in Jackson to have the best quality water that we can have. We realize that just as we waged a 100-year struggle for an affirmative right to vote that was finally granted by the federal government with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we want to ensure the citizens of Jackson that they can have an affirmative right to clean, safe, pure drinking water, that our rivers, creeks, and streams are clean and unpolluted. Because of the undemocratic way that Jackson was developed, flooding is also a challenge that we face. Natural waterways, creeks, and streams were not considered where formerly enslaved populations lived and still live. The effect is felt today in heavy rains, which in some instances is caused by the deforestation and the repurposing of agricultural and farmlands. We, the citizens of Jackson in the state of Mississippi, because of an ice storm this year, an old and out-of-date water delivery system have gone an average of 23 days without water. We believe it is within the power of the federal government to provide the resources necessary to change this. And we urge you to do so. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Frank. It's very clear that there are many structural things that were intentionally implemented. And so I think that, we can intentionally unimplement them, if that's a word, right? We can walk these things back. We have many of the answers already. It's just a question of the will to do it. I'm going to pass the microphone now to Queen Shabazz, who's in Virginia, and she's the founder of United Parents Against Lead, and she's going to talk about remediation issues. Queen.
Thank you, Lindsay. Good Thursday, everyone. Yes, I am the mother of a lead-poisoned son who was poisoned in 1996. And it's shameful that after 25 years of fighting this issue, children are still being poisoned by lead, either through the lead-based paint in the homes or through lead in the water. So know that there are no safe levels of lead. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the lead in the copper rule, which, on January 15th, the EPA published a revised rule, which took almost 30 years. The original one was issued back in 1991. So the new rule will dramatically slow down the rate at which lead pipes are required to be replaced, which will allow more and more children and families to be at risk of being poisoned by lead through the water. But President Biden's plan, I think was mentioned earlier, calls for about $45 billion for grants to help the water utilities replace the lead in water lines. So we're asking for full funding for lead line replacement, and that it must happen now, whether through the infrastructure plan or through Congress. The rate of replacement must also be bold. Lead lines must be replaced within 10 years because every day that a community drinks lead-tainted water, children's development is damaged for life. Lead is permanent and irreversible once it damages a child's brain. Biden's plan calls for at least 40% of benefits from federal investment to flow through to divested communities. And full and timely lead service replacement lines would help communities of color who have experienced this disinvestment for decades. And I, for one, would like to stop hearing about the funds trickling down, rather than why can't they just go directly to the impacted communities, being put in the hands of those many who are on this call that have been doing the work in these communities for years, know what is needed. Why do we have to wait for the funds to trickle down and maybe it'll get to us? Like when it's down to the last 1,000, they say, oh, here's some funding, how y'all gonna divide that up? So I'd like to change the whole trickle down thought process. And then talking about remediation, while over the years, we were addressing lead in paint, lead in water, I'm reminded also that we must remediate lead hazards dealing with our police departments. Nearly a day or week goes by that we don't see some type of killing, and the police, in addition to drinking perhaps lead-tainted water, also handling lead munitions on a daily basis. And so perhaps that would also remediate the damage that this police officer are suffering through lead poisoning. and don't want to face it. So I would also call for mandatory testing, that police officers should have mandatory testing for lead poison to see if they also have been poisoned due to the nature of their work. So if our children are getting poisoned, every time a person gets shot, they are lead poisoned because the bullets are made of lead. So let's be aware of remediating lead poisoning from that source as well. And thank you, Reverend Woodbury, for the invitation to participate in this very educational, meaningful call with EPA. Blessings, everyone.
Thank you, Queen. I definitely learned some things with your presentation. Thank you. Lastly, our last speaker, I'm going to pass it to Reverend Leo Woodbury, who's in Florence, South Carolina, and he's the Executive Director of New Alpha Community Development Corporation, who has brought us here today. Rev, I'm going to pass it off to you, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions.
Okay, thank you so much to everyone who has given some very amazing reports, and I want to thank Rosemary and Matthew and everyone at EPA's Office of Engagement and Public and Education. And I just want to start off by lifting up these words: speak truth to power. And often when we say that, we say it and we direct it towards opposition, but we need to speak truth to power as well to our friends and to our allies. And the fact of the matter is that we are in a new place, but we already know that we're not guaranteed, as Mustafa has so eloquently said, we're not guaranteed to be in this place approximately 17 months from now or 4 years from now. And so several people on this call have heard me call for creating an era of an iron will. And using that word iron and coming from a faith-based background, we have in the Bible a term that says iron sharpens iron. And when we say iron, we mean implementation, resoluteness, original thoughts, and novel approaches, because time is getting short and we have no guarantee. And so I want to talk about the fact that implementation is where we need to be. It's where the entire world is moving towards, whether we talk about what's happening with the United Nations, the Paris Agreement, the COPs, what's going on in the RGGI states, what's going on with states who have renewable portfolios, whether we're talking about cities that pass resolutions to go 100% renewable. The place where we are lacking is on the community level. And so we need to move towards implementation. And as we've already heard, it needs to be done in a cumulative fashion. So when we talk about cumulative fashion, we often equate that with air emissions, et cetera. And we definitely need that. When we look at communities like Camlet, Darwin Heights, North Carolina, where they have 6 polluting facilities within a 10-mile area. Used to be 10, but some closed down. And there's another one now that's applying for a permit. And we have to move beyond this single source measurement that we use that is not helping communities to stay healthy or to have land, air, and water that is safe and healthy to drink. We also have to look at how we moved in terms of cumulative approaches. And so there are a lot of great things that are going on in communities. And this work is being done by community-based organizations, their community-led solutions in places where people know the problems and they know how to come up with the solutions. And we think that it's very important that as we look at these solutions, that we make sure that those who make our policies and allocate budgeting, that they realize that we need to be working together. So one example I'll lift up deals with water. The demonstration project we have here in Florence with our solar powered hydro panels, which, draw in air, condenses the moisture from the air, turns it into clean drinking water. It's completely powered by solar, completely off grid. So we're not emitting any carbon and we're creating clean drinking water. And it's a cumulative approach to dealing with the problems that we have with climate change. Also, we need to look at cumulative approaches when we look at climate impacts. So when we have hurricanes, when we have flooding, particularly in rural areas, we get contamination with wells, we get a fusion from septic tanks, we get black mold and all of these sorts of things that happen in homes for people in communities. And we have to stop tackling these problems one at a time, but realize that when we have environmental issues, when we have climate impacts, that it's not enough for us to say, well, let's see if we're going to deal with a problem where people don't have access to clean drinking water, while simultaneously they have black mold growing in their homes, or they have pollution that has washed up on their land, where in cases like in Britain's neck, South Carolina, they have patches of land where nothing is growing anymore. And so a cumulative approach is very important. And I'll echo what has been said too about making sure that resources reach the community level and that these communities are led by people who are experienced when it comes to environmental justice, because they've been out here, they've been doing the work, and they know what approaches will give us solutions. That's very important because policymakers often look towards macro solutions. And we know that we have to have utilities and universities and others who are working on us addressing the issues of climate change and environmental injustice. But we've done that. We've taken this approach. We've taken this approach for decades, and the same problems remain. In fact, in many cases, the problems have worsened. And so we think that it's very important that the 40% of sustainability investments, and I agree with my dear friend Mustafa, that it shouldn't be 40% of just sustainable investment, but what we invest in our communities in this country should mirror the population of this country. We have approximately 40% of our population that is made up of people of color. So why are we still talking about trickling down resources to what is almost 50% of our population? So we believe that one of the most important things that can be done in terms of public engagement and education is that we talk to the people on the ground and the people in the communities who have solutions, who want to craft solutions, who know what the solutions are, and they are only not happening because we don't have the financial wherewithal to make those things happen. And I'm talking about flooding, I'm talking about air emissions, I'm talking about brownfields, so that we have to move beyond just looking at brownfields with Superfund sites that are huge. We did an assessment in Florence and Orangeburg, South Carolina, a few years back. Thank you, Lindsay. That was funded by U.S. Climate Action Network, and found that just metal contamination, that there were 70 sites in both of our cities that were small, but were right in the midst of areas where we had apartments, housing complexes, restaurants where people ate, where every time it rains or the wind blew, as far as we know, these contaminants are spreading. And so we are at a place and a time when people's voices need to be heard. And that is one of the reasons why we are hosting this briefing with this part of EPA's agency, because right now in America, across all of America, red and blue, black and white, brown, etc., people feel that their voices are not being heard. So whether they're in the streets at the Capitol on January 6th, or they're in the streets marching because of Black Lives Matter, or be around women's rights, or scientists, we all feel that our voices are not being heard. And so we want to encourage you to listen to the voices of the community, make sure that we're at the table, make sure the administrator knows that there are solutions that are happening every day, and those solutions need to be lifted up, they need to be funded, they need to be replicated, because we are moving, we are losing time, and we must bring in an era of the iron will. We have the money, we have the skills, we have the technology, but in large part, we are lacking the will to do the things that can make our world and this country a better place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Woodbury. That's an incredible way to close out our information sharing and folks sharing information about their lived experiences from around the country. And so I just want to say, appreciate you talking about the cumulative impacts, compound, synergistic impacts, and the intersectional ways, race, gender, location, all of these things, and our communities are bearing too much of the burden. And so I want to echo what Reverend Woodbury has said. So you have the answers to the questions. You have the people in the room. And so we just ask that you have those conversations so that we can get the ball rolling, because we don't have time. I want to go ahead and leave some space for Rosemary and Matthew to respond, or any questions you may have on our way out. We only have about 4 minutes, but we have 4 minutes.
No, I mean, I think thank you, Reverend Woodbury, for pulling this together, and thank you all for coming and participating. It's really great to hear from you all and to really understand some of the things that you all are prioritizing and how they tie in with the work that both the administration and the agency are focused on. When I heard Queen Shabazz talk about the lead in drinking water, I thought about the American Jobs Plan that is calling for 100% of the lead service lines to be removed and replaced. And those types of bold steps forward are things that we want your help in talking about and educating communities about, because this plan just provides so many investments in water infrastructure. When I heard Mr. Frank talk about Jackson, Mississippi, that's personal for me. And I'm sure it's personal for Adrian too. I'm from Jackson. And so, hearing him on the call to talk about this is really important and critical. And we need more voices out there having conversations and talking about it and flagging these issues to the government. We want to be held accountable. And so we are in a historic moment where there's a lot of work to do. And I'm excited to work with Matt Tejada and his team to be able to get a lot of this work done. I mean, even just recently in the American Rescue Plan, EPA got $50 million in order to go to EJ communities. And Matt's team is working diligently to try to figure out how we can work to get that to the communities that need it the most. So I'm gonna stop there and turn it over to Matt so that he can weigh in and just tell you guys some of the things that he's thinking about and working on. But I'm excited to work in conjunction with you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Rosemary. There's a lot of things already happening in this administration, as you all know, and as Adrian pointed out, a lot of things have already been done. There's even more things cooking on Capitol Hill, whether they happen now, whether they, set the stage for something in the future. There is a ton of work, and has never been more opportunity to actually advance justice, not just at EPA, but across the entire federal government and across the entire United States. And that's one thing that we've been lifting up in this moment, that's not just this administration, but really looking back, especially to last year, and a lot of the movement that came to a new level across all of the United States in terms of advancing justice. We have a chance to make a huge stride forward. And the one thing that I've shared, we were very excited, me and my staff across all of EPA. We've been struggling for a long time, and everyone got really excited in this moment that, oh my gosh, we're finally going to be able to do this work, right? We're finally going to be able to do the work that I came to EPA 8 years ago from Houston, where I was one of the people working on the community front lines with all of y'all. We're finally going to get that. We're going to get that opportunity, right? And it took somebody from the community to remind me, that's great. We're all excited, but don't forget, EJ's never not been a fight. EJ's always a fight. And even right now, as we're working to implement these executive orders, as we're trying to spend this American Rescue Plan money, there's a lot of work that's going to happen. And the one thing that I keep sharing with folks and to share with you all, we need to rejoice and we need to celebrate and lift up how the entire nation and all of our communities have arrived at this place, but to not forget the work we have now to do. And one of the chief things that I want to try to make happen in this moment is to really make transparent the sort of commitments that we make, the sort of commitments the entire federal government makes, and all of our partners. And that's not lost on me. When I worked in Houston, the only time I thought about EPA was when I was filing the suit against us. I thought about Texas. I thought about the city. I thought about the port. I thought about the school district. I thought about the hospital district, right? That's who I needed to help folks in Houston. And as we make the most of we can in this moment to make clear our commitment to advance justice in meaningful ways for our community. And at the end of that day, if we make those commitments clear, nobody's going to care if I go in and say, hey, you didn't do it. Nobody cares if Matt Tejada shows up in somebody's offices and says, hey, what happened? Right? And forgive me, Rosemary, not many people are going to care if Rosemary shows up and it's like, hey, what happened here? Right? It's you all. You all are the accountability at the end of the day, holding us accountable, watching what we make commitments to, reminding us, and you guys just did a bunch of it today, right? The specific things, the broad things, you are the accountability. Whoever I talk to in EPA, the ones that have actually changed their behavior have tried to figure out how to do their jobs differently, whether they're writing a rule or issuing a permit or going out and helping in a disaster. The ones that have changed their behavior have done it because they had to talk to somebody from the community that was impacted and realize, oh my gosh, I have a chance to help people that need help the most. What can I do to do that, right? How can I make that real? And this is the moment that we can hold your government accountable to making it real for the communities that have been left behind on purpose, that have been kept down and kept aside and disinvested and dumped on for generations and for centuries. And to lift that up and make that real in this time. And we need y'all to keep doing exactly what you're doing right now in good times and in bad, to hold all of us accountable, to take advantage of this moment that we have.
Thank you, Matthew. And thank you, Rosemary. If you all could briefly or quickly put your emails in the chat. I'm sure folks may have questions and want to follow up. I want to give a thank you to, again, Matthew, and to Rosemary, to EPA Office of Public Engagement and Education, to New Alpha Community Development Corporation, to all of our speakers, all of our attendees. Thank you for your time. We will be seeing each other soon, I hope. The accountability begins. Awesome. All right, please, folks, please take note of the email addresses in the chat before you go.
And that's just a little note. As long as you know somebody's name at EPA, it's last name dot first name at EPA.gov. You can find any of us. All right. And if you can't find somebody, just email Rosemary. I mean, we'll give you their number and their email. It's okay.
Thank you for that trick. Rev, should I pass you?
All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
You too.
Good seeing you, Reverend Woodbury.
Yes,
Thank
great.
you.
You'll see me again soon, Matthew.
I hope so. I hope so. I want to come visit you at your church again soon as we can.
Oh, yes. Great, great. And Rosemary, you too. Okay. We'll be talking soon.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Hi,
so much.
Rosemary.
Bye.
Thank
So
you,
long,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you,
Stay
Dr. Woodbury.
strong.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.